Before we dive into today's gripping story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us keep uncovering these hidden realities inside America's most secretive prisons. Now imagine this. You're a correctional officer trained to handle the nation's most dangerous men, terrorists, mob bosses, serial killers. But after years inside ADX Florence, you start to unravel. Welcome to the story of the officers behind the walls, the human cost of guarding America's Alcatraz of the Rockies. The U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence, stands silent in the Colorado desert. To the public, it's a fortress of control. To those who've worked inside, it's a machine that consumes people, both inmates and officers alike. The prison opened in 1994 after a series of violent attacks across the federal system. The Bureau of Prisons promised a place that would make chaos impossible, a clean, controlled environment where even the most violent offenders could be safely contained. Inside its thick walls are men like the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, cartel kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and Ramzi Youssef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But this story isn't about them. It's about the ones who walk in every day wearing a badge, and walk out slowly losing themselves. For many officers, ADX starts like any other federal assignment. The pay is good. The facility is new. The reputation, unmatched. But behind that sense of pride lies an environment so psychologically isolating, even the guards begin to feel imprisoned. A 2019 report from the Marshall Project and the New York Times revealed testimonies from former staff who described ADX as mentally exhausting and spiritually draining. Some compare the experience to being locked up alongside the inmates, except their sentence had no release date. Officers work in silence. They patrol corridors where voices echo from behind steel doors but rarely from another human face. Every movement is scripted. The sound of automatic locks, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sight of cameras watching every step. There are no spontaneous moments, only control, repetition, and isolation. For many, that routine starts to eat away at something inside. One retired guard, who spoke anonymously to NBC News, said, "You can't show fear. You can't show weakness. But after years it gets in your head. The quiet, the paranoia, it follows you home." In the beginning, most officers think they're immune. They laugh about the horror stories, the suicides, the psychological evaluations. But soon they start to understand what ADX really does. It isolates everyone, inmate or not. The architecture itself is part of the system. Every cell is built to limit human contact. No direct lines of sight between inmates, no conversations across walls. Officers communicate through intercoms, doors, and cameras. A human being can serve 20 years there and never physically touch another person. And yet, while the inmates are monitored for signs of breakdown, no one monitors the officers. Over time, small cracks begin to show. Divorce rates rise. Alcohol use increases. Some turn bitter, cold, others quiet and withdrawn. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology noted that correctional officers working in supermax facilities like ADX suffer some of the highest PTSD and suicide rates among law enforcement professions. They're expected to maintain order among men who've killed, plotted terror attacks, or led international cartels, and yet their biggest battle often happens in silence behind closed doors at home. The irony is brutal. The same design that's supposed to prevent violence often creates psychological strain. The officers, much like the inmates, live under constant surveillance, routine, and distrust. A former mental health staff member once said, "At ADX you can tell when someone's breaking, but you can't do anything. The system doesn't bend for emotion." This story, the story of ADX officers, is one that rarely leaves the walls. But over the years, whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and even lawsuits have begun to shed light on what's happening behind those polished gates. And it all starts with the simple truth. ADX doesn't just contain evil. It transforms everyone who enters. Inside ADX Florence, even the officers are bound by an invisible chain, one forged from silence, control, and unrelenting vigilance. Every shift begins the same way. Metal detectors, security checks, weapon inspections, and a briefing that reminds them of the stakes. No mistakes. No empathy. No weakness. The officers are trained to be alert but detached. Emotion, they're told, can be fatal. But over time, detachment turns into something else. Disconnection. Many of the men and women who clock in at 7 a.m. begin to feel as if they're not just guarding prisoners, they're part of the structure itself, trapped in a psychological system that consumes compassion and spits out paranoia. The illusion of control. The Bureau of Prisons, BOP, markets ADX as the most secure correctional environment in America, and that's true. The facility is built with precision engineering designed to eliminate chaos. Remote-controlled doors that open and close from control booths. Single inmate cells measuring roughly 7 by 12 feet, lined with polished concrete. Thick glass barriers to prevent physical contact during visits. Automated meal slots so officers never need to interact directly with inmates. On paper, it's flawless, the perfect solution to violence. But perfection has a cost. A former officer named Richard, who worked at ADX for over 12 years, told The Guardian in 2020. You stop being human after a while. You become mechanical. The job isn't just to control inmates, it's to control yourself. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in isolation, but officers often feel like they're serving the same sentence. The constant hum of cameras, the echo of doors, the absence of sunlight, it all builds a rhythm that seeps into the subconscious. Even on their days off, officers report hearing phantom intercoms or the sound of steel doors slamming shut in their heads. Haunted by silence. Unlike other prisons where chaos is audible, shouts, footsteps, radios, ADX is eerily quiet. Each tier is built with acoustic suppression so sound barely travels. Some officers describe it as walking through a tomb that breathes. One correctional counselor, identified only as JM, said during a 2019 interview with the Marshall Project. You start craving noise. The silence eats at you. You walk through concrete halls and it feels like the building is listening. In that silence, thoughts grow louder. The mind begins to play tricks. Some guards report dreams of being locked inside the cells they monitor, recurring nightmares where they swap places with the inmates. Others experience heightened anxiety, insomnia, or bursts of aggression that surprise even their families. When home isn't an escape. For many ADX officers, the hardest part isn't the job, it's leaving it behind. The paranoia doesn't stay inside the gates. One officer's wife told NBC News in a 2017 interview. He'd sit facing the door at restaurants. Always scanning, always tense. He'd jump at small noises. It was like he couldn't turn it off. Marriage counselors in Fremont County, where ADX is located, have quietly acknowledged an unspoken epidemic, relationship breakdowns and substance abuse among correctional staff. Alcohol becomes a coping mechanism. Detachment becomes a shield. Officers joke about having ADX in your blood, but underneath the humor is a deeper truth. The environment rewires your brain. A retired psychologist from the Federal Bureau of Prisons once described it as institutional contamination, the process by which prolonged exposure to extreme control systems alters emotional capacity and empathy. It's not just the inmates who adapt to isolation, she said, the staff do too. They start to mimic the environment. The breaking point. Some officers hold out longer than others, but everyone eventually hits a wall. There are stories of sudden resignations, men walking off duty mid-shift, never to return. Others quietly take medical leave and never come back. In 2016, a federal report on workplace stress inside high-security prisons identified ADX Florence as one of the most mentally taxing correctional assignments in the country. The report found alarming trends. Increased depression and anxiety among long-term staff. Elevated blood pressure and sleep disorders. Higher rates of suicide attempts compared to officers in medium-security facilities. One of the most tragic cases involved a veteran guard who took his own life shortly after retirement. According to co-workers, he couldn't stand the silence after leaving. He said the world outside felt too open, too unpredictable. In his suicide note, he wrote one line that still circulates among officers who knew him. I got out, but it's still in me. Trained to be unbreakable. The federal government offers psychological screenings for new correctional officers, but few resources exist for long-term trauma support. Many fear that admitting stress or burnout will mark them as unfit for duty, a career death sentence. So they stay quiet. They wear their discipline like armor, burying emotion beneath professionalism. But underneath the uniform, cracks form. The officers who were once proud to work in the most secure prison in America begin to question whether the real prison is the one inside their minds. ADX Florence was designed to contain the most dangerous criminals in U.S. history. But in doing so, it built a new kind of psychological battlefield, one that no one truly leaves behind. In the next chapter, we'll explore the rare moments when the line between officer and inmate starts to blur, and how some guards begin to identify, even sympathize, with the men they're trained to control. The strangest transformation inside ADX Florence isn't physical, it's psychological. Over months and years, some correctional officers begin to notice something deeply unsettling. They start to understand the very men they were trained to fear. It's not sympathy for criminals. It's something harder to define, a reflection. When you spend years in an environment of silence, surveillance, and isolation, the differences between guard and inmate begin to blur. The uniforms change, but the walls remain the same. Mirror reflections in concrete walls. In ADX, every interaction between officer and inmate is designed to minimize emotion. The cells have no bars, only steel doors and narrow windows with a sliver of sky. Conversations happen through intercoms or food slots. A prisoner's daily exercise takes place in a cage, a concrete pit with no view of other humans. Officers are told never to personalize these moments. Stay professional, the Bureau instructs. No emotion, no familiarity. But reality is different. An officer identified as Thomas, who worked at ADX for 7 years, told Reuters in 2021. When you're standing outside a door and you hear a man talk to himself for hours, beg for a voice to answer back, you start to realize you're both trapped. One just has the key. Thomas described moments when inmates would ask questions like, "Do you ever feel like you're in here with us?" He'd laugh it off, but deep down he knew the answer was yes. Humanity behind the badge. ADX was built to strip away unpredictability, but no system can erase human nature. Over time, some officers began bending small rules, lingering for a few extra seconds during a meal drop, responding to an inmate's question instead of walking past. Tiny moments of humanity in a place built to suppress it. One officer, who requested anonymity in an interview with the Marshall Project, described a moment that changed him. There was an inmate who hadn't spoken to anyone in months. I slid his tray through the slot and said, "Morning?" He froze, then whispered back, "Thanks." That was the only word he said all week. And it hit me, that one word meant more than I realized. The Bureau's rules are strict. Emotional exchanges are discouraged, empathy is seen as weakness, and officers are constantly reminded of manipulation risks. But psychologists who've studied supermax facilities say emotional suppression itself becomes a form of trauma. Psychological convergence. A 2015 study in criminal justice and behavior coined a term for what happens inside these institutions: psychological convergence. It describes the phenomenon where inmates and officers develop similar coping mechanisms: emotional numbness, hypervigilance, distrust, and detachment. In ADX Florence, that convergence is magnified. Officers begin adopting the same behaviors they observe daily: scanning for danger, avoiding eye contact, distrusting everyone. It's not a choice. It's adaptation. Former Warden Robert Hood once famously said, "ADX is not designed for humanity. It's a clean version of hell." He wasn't just referring to the inmates, the invisible wall between roles. There's an unspoken rule among ADX staff: never let them see your thoughts. But that wall cuts both ways. After years, many officers admit they don't even understand their own emotions anymore. They've built psychological walls identical to the prison's architecture: impenetrable, windowless, and silent. One retired officer explained it like this: you start out guarding the worst of the worst. Then you end up guarding yourself. He recalled a moment during his 10th year when he was monitoring the cell of a domestic terrorist. The inmate was pacing, muttering, counting steps. I realized I was doing the same thing in my head, counting, pacing, trying to pass time. That's when I knew I'd been here too long. Inside the control room. Perhaps the eeriest place in ADX isn't the cells, it's the control room. A windowless command center filled with monitors that display every corner of the prison. Guards sit for hours watching grainy footage of men who never look back. No daylight. No sound. Just flickering images, a modern panopticon. Psychologists compare it to emotional sensory deprivation. The officers see but never engage. They exist in a state of hyper-awareness but complete emotional starvation. One guard told the Denver Post in 2019, "You spend 12 hours watching people in cages. When you get home you still see them. You turn off the TV and there's silence, the same kind of silence. That silence becomes a part of life, one that's hard to escape." Some officers report developing obsessive routines, checking locks at home multiple times, sitting in their cars before entering their house just to decompress from control. Crossing the line. In rare cases, the psychological erosion leads to boundary violations. Officers who snap, lose control, or cross ethical lines. There have been documented incidents of overuse of force, verbal breakdowns, and emotional confrontations between staff and inmates. A 2012 internal BOP memo, later leaked during a lawsuit, described empathy fatigue and behavioral slippage among ADX staff, noting that prolonged exposure to extreme isolation environments can result in emotional dysregulation, even among trained officers. The institution that prides itself on control quietly acknowledges that no one is immune to the environment it creates. When the badge feels heavy. By year 10, the line between professional and personal identity collapses. Officers who once introduced themselves as federal employees now describe themselves as keepers of ghosts. Their nightmares aren't about violence, they're about emptiness. Some say they wake up at night expecting to hear the clank of steel doors or the monotone call of control to unit. One officer said in a 2020 Vice News feature, "You go home but your mind stays there. You start talking like them, thinking like them. It's like ADX gets inside your head and rearranges the furniture." And yet, every morning hundreds of men and women still show up. They put on their uniforms, walk past the razor wire and prepare to do it all again. Because despite the toll, despite the trauma, there's a deep sense of duty, the belief that if they don't hold the line no one else will. Transition. But some officers do break that silence. A few speak out, in lawsuits, in interviews, in retirement confessions. And what they reveal isn't just about their personal pain, it's about the moral cost of maintaining absolute control in a system that leaves no space for compassion. There's an unspoken rule inside ADX Florence. What happens here stays here. It's not written in policy but every officer understands it. Breaking that silence means risking your job, your reputation, and sometimes your safety. Yet over the years, a handful of officers have decided to speak. Not because they wanted revenge or fame, but because they couldn't carry the weight of silence any longer. These are the stories of those who cracked the code of secrecy inside America's most secure prison, and paid the price. The thin line between loyalty and conscience. For most officers, loyalty is everything. Loyalty to the badge. To your fellow officers. To the Bureau of Prisons. You don't question orders and you never air dirty laundry. But what happens when following the rules starts to break you from the inside? In 2014, a veteran officer, let's call him Officer Martinez, reached his breaking point. He had worked at ADX for nearly a decade. Known for his discipline and quiet efficiency, Martinez was the kind of officer everyone respected. But one day he noticed something that would change everything. His co-workers were falling apart, mentally and emotionally, and no one seemed to care. He began keeping notes, small observations written in code in his pocketbook. Officer D, panic attack during rounds. Officer J, drinking before night shift. Officer S, suspended after emotional outburst. At first, he told himself he was documenting this for internal awareness. But as months turned into years, he realized no one was going to read it. "We were trained to monitor inmate behavior," he told the Marshall Project later, "but no one monitored us." When Martinez submitted a confidential report on staff burnout and PTSD to the Bureau's regional office, it disappeared into what he called the bureaucratic void. Weeks later he was transferred to a different unit. Officially, it was for operational rotation. Unofficially, it was a warning. Don't bring attention. Whistleblowers from ADX often describe the same response pattern: isolation, retaliation, or forced silence. One former mental health counselor, Patricia Ewing, spoke to the Denver Post in 2019 about her time at the facility. "When I raised concerns about officer trauma and inmate deterioration, I was told, 'Don't bring attention to this. It makes us look weak.'" That phrase, "makes us look weak," echoes through multiple testimonies. In the hyper-controlled culture of ADX, weakness is dangerous. Both inmates and officers are expected to suppress emotion. Vulnerability is seen as liability. But silence has consequences. A 2018 Government Accountability Office (GAO) review found that the Bureau of Prisons had no formal mental health program for staff working in extreme isolation units, despite documented risks. The review concluded that ADX officers face significant occupational stress without adequate institutional support. The cost of speaking out. For those who did speak out, the personal cost was devastating. In 2016, Officer Sean Harper, not his real name, filed an internal complaint alleging that prolonged exposure to isolation conditions was causing officers to develop symptoms consistent with complex PTSD. Instead of being supported, Harper found himself ostracized. "They called me unstable," he told Vice News. "I was told to take leave. I wasn't crazy, I was just tired of pretending everything was fine." He would later leave the Bureau entirely, but the experience haunted him. He said the worst part wasn't the trauma, it was the denial from those in charge. They teach us to be strong, but they ignore the fact that this place breaks strong people every day. The lawsuits that forced the walls open. 4 years, ADX operated in near total secrecy. But that began to change in 2012, when a group of inmates filed a groundbreaking lawsuit, Baycoat versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. The case alleged that ADX Florence failed to provide adequate mental health care, both to inmates and indirectly to the staff forced to manage them. During the hearings, lawyers unearthed internal memos and testimonies that revealed just how severe the psychological conditions had become. One psychologist described staff members suffering from secondary trauma, absorbing the despair of the men they supervised. Another admitted that suicide watch wasn't just for inmates, it had been quietly extended to staff in extreme cases. The revelation stunned the public. The New York Times reported in 2015 that the same mechanisms of control that prevent violence also cultivate deep psychological decay. For the first time, America began to see ADX not just as a fortress of discipline, but as a pressure cooker, one where both sides of the bars were breaking down. The lawsuit resulted in significant reforms: improved mental health screenings, a modest staff wellness program, and more oversight. But former officers say those changes were cosmetic, surface-level responses to deeper rot. Behind closed doors. Even after these cases, officers who spoke up still faced resistance. One internal memo leaked in 2017 warned staff against unauthorized contact with media, citing potential disciplinary action. In other words, don't talk. That silence became a second kind of confinement, a psychological prison built from fear of losing pensions, rank, or reputation. One anonymous officer wrote in an online forum for correctional staff, "We guard the monsters of society, but no one guards us." That line became symbolic in discussions about ADX, a haunting reminder that while the world focused on inmates like El Chapo or the Unabomber, the officers themselves were slipping through the cracks of an invisible crisis. The whistleblower paradox. 4 whistleblowers speaking out brings both relief and regret. Officer Martinez, now retired, says he still dreams of the cell blocks, the endless gray corridors, the locked doors, the echo of his own footsteps. But he also believes silence would have been worse. People think we're heroes or villains. The truth is, we're just people trying to survive a place that doesn't care about survival. He testified in a 2020 congressional hearing about correctional mental health, calling for nationwide reform and routine psychological evaluation for staff in high-security facilities. His final words at the hearing were simple: "You can't build a humane system if the people running it are broken." The room fell silent. The systemic irony. The same psychological rigidity that defines ADX's control structure, the refusal to show weakness, the obsession with order, prevents the institution from healing itself. It's a closed loop. The culture that demands strength ensures that no one ever asks for help. Psychologists call this the fortress mindset. It's the belief that vulnerability threatens safety, a mentality that starts as protection but evolves into self-destruction. And in ADX Florence, that fortress is literal. Transition. As we move deeper into this story, the picture becomes darker, because the truth is, not all who break the silence do so publicly. Some officers vanish quietly, resigning, moving away, or simply disappearing into civilian life. And others never leave the mental walls behind. The story of ADX Florence is often told as one of power, order, and control, a fortress designed to contain the worst of the worst. But behind those concrete walls, the truth runs deeper. Control always comes at a cost. For the inmates, it's isolation. For the officers, it's erosion of sleep, of peace, of self. These are men and women who walk through a gate each day believing they're keeping the world safe, never realizing the toll it takes on their own minds. Many will retire quietly, never speaking of what they saw or what they became inside. Others will break, not from violence, but from silence. ADX Florence may be America's most secure prison, but no wall is thick enough to keep the human mind untouched. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden side of America's prison system, take a second to support the channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, some prisons don't need walls to hold you in.